So, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Distant Coder, and welcome back to another episode of answering your ruling questions. Haven't done this one in a while, but I did go over the comments of the last video, so I could pull a couple of rulings, put into this video, and answer those for you. So do keep in mind that if you guys do want to ask a ruling question for a later video, you can do so by putting a ruling question in the comment section of this video, and I'll go through those for my next video. Okay, so this first ruling question comes to us from David Muraku, and they ask, Dimensional Shifter versus Pendulums, are they sent to the extra deck or are they banished? So in the case of pendulum monsters, we know that if they go from the field to the graveyard, they go to the extra deck instead. So the way this will work under something like Macrocosmos or Dimensional Shifter is that a pendulum monster is considered to be sent to the graveyard and simply redirected to the extra deck via the pendulum mechanic. In this situation, the Dimension Shifter will override that pendulum mechanic that redirects it to the extra deck and instead redirect the monster that would be going to the graveyard to the banished. So for that reason, under Dimension Shifter, pendulum monsters are banished even if they're in the scale or from the monster zone. As long as they would be sent to the graveyard and go to the extra deck instead, they will get banished instead of going to the extra deck in this scenario. Okay, so this next ruling question comes to us from Phil, and they ask, do Xyz Material monsters go to the graveyard under Dimensional Fissure? So Dimensional Fissure specifies that monsters sent to the graveyard are banished instead. So in the case of an Xyz Material, yes, more often than not, they will be monster cards, but while they are an Xyz Material, they are not considered to be a monster. They're nothing more than an Xyz Material. So in that situation, what's going to happen is when you detach an Xyz Material for the cost of the Xyz monster, or even if the Xyz monster is destroyed, those materials aren't considered to be monsters until they've hit the graveyard, which at that point is too late to redirect them to be banished instead of being sent to the grave. So for that reason, an Xyz material that is either detached from an Xyz monster, or if the Xyz monster leaves the field, those materials are still going to be sent to the graveyard under Dimensional Fissure. This next question comes to us from Ned, and they ask, hey Coder, two-part question. If I activated the effect of Verte Anaconda to send Super Poly, do I still have to discard for cost even though the Verte cost has been paid? And can your opponent respond to it with Super Poly's restriction? So, in the case of Verte Anaconda, it only copies the effect of the fusion spell that it sent to the graveyard and none of the other parts of the card. So the effect of Super Poly is specifically only to fusion summon using monsters from either player's field. So the cost portion of Super Poly is not copied by Verte, neither is the additional part of Super Poly's text that says that your opponent cannot respond to it, because that part of the text is not part of Super Poly's effect. So Verte will only copy the effect portion. It's the same reason why if you send Red Eyes Fusion, you're allowed to have summoned before having sent it off the Verte and something like that. So for that reason, Verte only copies the effect, so you won't discard and your opponent is allowed to respond to the effect of your Verte Anaconda that's going to copy Super Poly. This next ruling question comes to us from Jeffrey, and they ask, Chimeritic Rampage effect to send 2 machines during turn 1 or main phase 2. So basically what the question here is are you allowed to use that effect of Chimeritic Rampage Dragon? So the effect of Chimeritic Rampage Dragon sends up to 2 machine monsters from your deck to the graveyard, and if you do, the Rampage gains a number of attacks equal to the number of machine monsters you sent to the graveyard for this effect. So the reason why you are allowed to activate the Chimeritic Rampage on turn 1 or during the main phase 2 is specifically because it doesn't only have the effect to gain the additional attacks. It has also the effect to send from the deck to the graveyard, and that is not a cost. In the case of if Rampage Dragon did send for cost and all the actual effect was to gain attacks, you wouldn't be allowed to use it, which is the reason why for something like Mermail Abyss Megalo can't use its effect to tribute another water monster for cost in order to gain a second attack. You can't use that effect during the first turn of the duel or during the main phase 2. So because the Chimeritic Rampage Dragon doesn't only gain the attacks, it also sends from deck to the graveyard for effect and not for cost, you are allowed to activate the Chimeritic Rampage on turn 1 and during the main phase 2 of a duel. This next ruling question comes to us from Adrian Brunner, and they ask, I have a question about the Sulfachord scale effects. The low levels have the scale effect, Pendulum summons of your Sulfachord Pendulum monsters cannot be negated. If the scale effect is active, can a card be activated to negate the summon of any non-Sulfachord monsters during that Pendulum summon, even if at least one Sulfachord is summoned? So basically for this example, I'm going to use the text on Sulfachord Cutia. So Q tier reads that the Pendulum summon of your Sulfachord monsters cannot be negated. So what they are asking here is if you Pendulum summon while you have Q tier in your Pendulum scale, and you Pendulum summon, for example, one Sulfachord monster and one non-Sulfachord monster, and your opponent wants to negate the Pendulum summon with, say, Solemn Strike. They are legally allowed to activate the Solemn Strike, and in this case, what will happen is the Solemn Strike will only negate the Pendulum summon of the non-Sulfachord monster you summoned. The Sulfachord monster that you're attempting to Pendulum summon here will not have its Pendulum summon negated. Now, the interesting thing with this is that if you did only Pendulum summon Sulfachord monsters while you have Q-Tia in your scale, if your opponent wanted to activate Solemn Strike, that would be an illegal activation in that case. So, if you're only Pendulum summoning Sulfachord monsters, your opponent is not legally allowed to activate a card that would negate your Pendulum summon, but if you Pendulum summon literally any other monster, even if you have a Sulfachord monster in that Pendulum summon, as long as you've Pendulum summoned at least one non-Sulfachord monster, if your opponent activates Solemn Strike, which is legal in that case, it will only negate the Pendulum summon of the monster that is not a Sulfachord monster. Your Sulfachord monsters will still successfully be Pendulum summoned in this situation. So this next ruling question comes to us from Spire of the Wolves, and they ask, if Miscellaneousaurus's hand effect has resolved, can my opponent activate Super Poly in that main phase and use my dinosaur monsters as fusion material? So, in the case of Super Poly, it is considered an activated effect and must be able to affect the monsters that it's trying to send off as fusion materials. So, if you have resolved the Miscellaneousaurus previously in that main phase, you cannot activate the Super Polymerization and attempt to use your opponent's dinosaur monsters because they are unaffected by the activated effects of an opponent's card, and because the Super Polymerization is an activated effect that affects the monsters, you will not be able to use dinosaur monsters as fusion material with Super Poly under Miscellaneousaurus. So this last question comes to us from Jules, and they ask, if I control Plunder Patrol Booty and Goes in Match, and my opponent has two monsters of the same attribute, what happens if I try to change the attribute of one of those monsters? So, under Goes in Match, you're only allowed to control one attribute at a time. If you have Plunder Patrol Booty, it has the effect that you can target a monster your opponent controls and change its attribute to a different attribute. So if your opponent controls two, say, water monsters, for example, and you have Goes in Match face up, and you activate the Booty effect to target one of their two water monsters and change it into a fire, that monster, as soon as the Plunder Patrol Booty resolves, will immediately be sent to the graveyard because they are of a new attribute that your opponent is not legally allowed to control due to the effect of Goes in Match. Goes in Match will not give your opponent the choice of which of those two monsters they want to keep. They will force you to keep the monster of the original attribute you controlled. So under Goes in Match, Plunder Patrol Booty essentially becomes a Mystical Space Typhoon for monsters. Not exactly, but kinda. Whatever monster you'll target and change the attribute to will immediately be sent to the graveyard. So it's a pretty neat interaction for those of you Plunder players. If you guys are like hyped to play with the new Black Eyes, it's a really cool card, and Plunder's a really cool deck. So yeah, this is a pretty neat interaction that you guys get to abuse a little bit if you're playing Plunder Patrol. Anyways, guys, that's gonna be it for this episode of answering your ruling questions. Don't forget, if you guys do want to take part in this series, leave your ruling questions in the comment section of this video. And just a little shout over here, I do have a Patreon now, and if you guys do join my Patreon, I'm going to do a special once a month answering ruling questions video where I take ruling questions exclusively from my patrons. So if you guys do want to have a shot at being 100% guaranteed in one of these videos, go ahead and subscribe to me on Patreon. Give me that little, you know, subscribe-a-rooney. Hit me up with that coder 5 on Patreon, and you guys get to join my Discord, have a special Patreon exclusive chat where you guys can ask me ruling questions and you guys can take part in these videos. So thank you so much, guys, and I'll see all of you in the next video. Peace. So very educational. Yeah, can I get some Peppo G's in the chat, please? Can I get some Peppo G's in the chat? Take notes. I'm giving you guys ruling knowledge. Take notes!